morning, everybody. And happy Easter. Happy Easter. I'm glad to see you all this morning. I was talking with Bub this morning, and I saw the email she sent you all too. It's hard for me to believe there are just 2 more classes after this. It feels a little too early, but that's the end of April. So anyway, we're almost there. So we've got today, we've got 2 more weeks, and that's it for Kings. That's terrible. Thank you. I love that. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapters 7 and 8. We kind of finished chapter 6 last week, and I think that that's going to give us a really good way to kind of slide to the end. I think that you all see this in your bookmark, but we essentially have today, next week, about Solomon, and then the last week, we're going to do a whole bunch of the ways that the kingdoms devolved into the exile. So you've heard me speak of the exile so many times. I'm sure it is exhausting to you. But the exile was such this pivotal moment that defined Judaism forever. I want to make sure that we can make the connection from Saul, David, Solomon through the mess of the northern, southern kingdoms down into the exile. So that's really the last week of our study. That will be in 2 weeks, the very last one. And so do be thinking about questions that you may have about the exile. I'm not certain that we will do the exile with any specificity in RBS because there really isn't a way to do that. I mean, probably the best way to do the study of the exile would be Daniel, which we've already done. Daniel's probably the #1 book that people would read to learn about what happened in the exile. We've sort of done that. But I do want us to look at the way that the kingdoms fell apart. And so we've got a little bit of that today. When we get to chapter 8, there's this very interesting prayer moment with Solomon that kind of prefigures the exile. And so we're going to talk about that. But be thinking of your questions. And a reminder, those of you joining us online, that if you go to stmichael.org/RBS, you can see all 150-something plus episodes of RBS that you can listen to all summer long. Oh my gosh, you can go back. I will tell you, it is both flattering and unnerving when people tell me that they have gone back and listened to all of these old studies, like over the summer or over holiday breaks, because, Lord, I don't even know what I said half the time. And so I'm hoping that it's all still, helpful. I do think, what's the one thing I was going to tell you? Bub, thankfully, looked at all of these episodes and realized that we didn't have a standard way of categorizing all the episodes. It was sort of named by the book and the chapter, maybe. And so she has had our communications department go back and retitle all of the episodes. So what you have are seasons and episodes. That's the very first thing you see for all the different digital files. So if you go to the podcast or if you go to our website, it will make a lot more sense, just like one of your favorite TV shows. You can look at season and episode and know exactly the right order that everything was laid out. I mean, how smart is that? Thank you, Bub. So let's start with a prayer and we'll get rolling. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, as we begin this Easter season, we ask your blessing upon us. Help empty us of all the things that weigh on us, that worry us, that cause us stress or fear. Help us make space inside of us for your spirit of peace to fill us. As we come together to study your word, give us an hour where we get a chance to set aside all the things of the world that weigh on us so we can be refilled and refreshed and inspired once again to be your hands and feet of love in the world, that as fear creeps in and as uncertainty creeps in, we can help remind ourselves and those we love of your promise of hope, that what we see is not all there is, and that life goes on forever. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So I don't know about you all, but it's Easter, which is so nice. And we have all this stuff in the world swirling around us. I mean, I swear it's like it almost seems like more than once a day now. we get bad news about something. And I want to encourage you, even though we're not a small group, and we don't look at each other in the eye when we ask questions or have conversations, it's okay to bring some of that into this space as well. So if you've got wonderings or concerns, or as we read through sections like this, like today we're going to look at a section where Solomon goes through and essentially lays out what you can pray for, what we can pray for. I want you to kind of bring in real world stuff to this moment, because I think it can help everyone else if we can contextualize what it is that we're studying and it not just be theoretical. I think that helps everybody, including me. And so we'll get there today. So open yourself up, and if you've got some questions or observations, I think it will be helpful to everyone else. So let's start with 1 Kings chapter 7. So as we noted 2 weeks ago, before Holy Week, Solomon was preparing to build the temple, but it's not just the only big building project that Solomon is embarking upon. Solomon is also embarking upon a building project for his own palace and other homes. I should say that we've got 3 sections of today's study: Solomon's building projects, the dedication of the temple, and then how Solomon sets about the culture of prayer. So those are the 3 sections for today. So we're going to start with the building projects. Solomon is embarking upon major building projects. This is very different than where Israel has been over its history. Israel was not really, up to this point, a culture of big, major building projects. That sets it apart differently than many other empires. Most of the time, we're familiar with empires once they claim land and they unify their people and they set themselves up in a leadership structure, they build a bunch of stuff. Because those buildings, essentially, not only do they last beyond the leader who built them, but they also create a very physical representation of the grandeur of the empire. It helps create an identity for the people. We totally get this. When you think, if I say to you, think of what defines American identity, I guarantee that all of us, in those images that float through our minds, at least a few, if not the majority of those images, are about built stuff. So whether that's the Capitol building in DC, or the Washington Memorial, or the Statue of Liberty, or, we can go on and on. There are things that represent a feeling or a culture of identity as Americans. Well, it's the same kind of thing in other empires. There are physical representations of cultural identity. And Solomon is the one that begins to lean into those physical spaces more than anyone before him. Up to this point, Israel was essentially a bunch of different tribes. We spoke about how Saul attempted to unify Israel, but that didn't really work quite so clearly. Then David did unify Israel, but when we speak of David's unifying impact is primarily political. And I would say maybe military. So David's unifying impact created a political and a military identity that was unique up to that point. But even David didn't really build stuff. Solomon takes that political and military unity and he begins to represent it with these huge building projects. I want to say maybe 3 weeks ago, we talked about the danger of having a king. And I referenced back to Deuteronomy and other bits in the Old Testament where essentially Israel was warned about the largesse of a king. Solomon is now expressing that concern. Solomon now represents the concern. Solomon doesn't express the concern. Solomon represents the concern that when you've got a king, you've got a big old top-heavy system that all the people underneath have to support. That changes the way that Israel functions. That changes the way that individuals within the country function. And now Solomon is making that kind of big impact. And so there are 2 big building projects that are spoken about explicitly here in chapter 7. The first is Solomon's palace. The second is the temple. That is the big capital T temple for the people. Let's look at chapter 7 and focus on the palace first. Chapter 7, verse 1. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of the Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams on the pillars. It was roofed with cedar on the 45 rafters, 15 in each row, which were on the pillars. There were window frames in the 3 rows facing each other in the 3 rows. All the doorways and doorposts had 4-sided frames opposite, facing each other, blah, blah, blah. Then it says, he had a hall of pillars, 50 cubits long. He made a hall of the throne where it was to pronounce judgment, a hall of justice, covered with cedars, floor to floor. His own house where he would reside in the other court back of the hall was of the same construction. Now look at the second part of verse 8. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. So we're going to stop there. Solomon's house is described as being very grand. And you heard him mention cedar over and over and over. The cedars of Lebanon is part of the ancient world. They were these big old massive trees. And we heard 2 weeks ago that Solomon had begun to deal with and work with other foreign governments. And so he had written to the king of the area of the Lebanon, and he was going to trade his food for their trees. And so remember, they were going to cut the trees down, float them down the Mediterranean, and then be able to bring them inland to Jerusalem. Just as a quick note, Jerusalem's not on the coast. It is much harder to build a city that isn't on the coast. If you think about Egypt, for example, all of Egypt's major cities were on the river because the river provides the opportunity to move big, heavy stuff easily. So to take a bunch of these big, heavy trees from the Mediterranean inland to Jerusalem is not easy. And so even more grand to build your palace out of materials that are hard to get. In a sense, it's like if someone built their house here with Italian marble, or you name it, people would say you could have just used Austin stone. But no, it is much fancier to build it from materials that have to make it over here from some other part of the world, because then you're super fancy. Solomon is essentially doing the same thing. When people go to his palace, I read this and I think, why use wood? Wood in the end is going to wear out faster than stone. Well, the answer is because wood is much fancier. And so Solomon is displaying his wealth and his power and his capacity to do things that are beyond the norm by using all of these big cedar logs. And he creates hall after hall. Imagine this is like big palace throne room style hall. So when he receives foreign dignitaries, they're going to have to pass through these massive rooms, which just communicate, not so subtly, how grand Solomon actually is. So we've got this palace, but then note in verse 8, Solomon also built a house like this for Pharaoh's daughter. It's interesting to me, as I was reading through this again, why would Solomon go through the trouble of building all of these buildings? It's a shift from the culture that he inherited. They really weren't building big buildings like this. Israel wasn't. Solomon began to build these buildings, and it was also at the point in time where he had married an Egyptian princess. So Egypt at the time was renowned for their huge building projects. At this point in history, the pyramids at Giza are done. They exist. So if we think about if we try to place Solomon in some part of history, Solomon is at the point in time where the big second empire of Egypt has now arisen. And that second empire of Egypt's the big building empire. And they do all of this stuff. But that's after the first big Egyptian empire of people like Ramses, where they built huge things. And so an Egyptian princess, it is not out of scope to think that she would have been married off to Solomon, and that's a good political unifier. But she would have showed up, and she would have said, "What's all this crap? Where's your stuff? And I can just imagine these conversations would have sunk into Solomon such that Solomon would be like, yeah, where is all my stuff? And so he has begun these building projects with a grand eye that is certainly not on the scale of Egypt, but he's trying. And so in addition, you've got this secondary house, maybe secondary palace really, that would be for one of his wives, specifically the princess of Egypt, who is now living there. Now this is, in addition to her influence on Solomon, likely being a component of why Solomon would have gone through these big building projects, we also have a very interesting note that she's essentially given her own space. Now, back then, husbands and wives, I mean, kings and their wives would not have really lived together. I mean, you've probably all taken grand tours of places like Versailles and all these other places where you see you've got the king's wing and then the queen's wing. I mean, they never like slept in the same room, let alone the same bed. You had their own staffs, their own spaces and all that sort of stuff. So the fact that Solomon's wives would have had their own space, not terribly unique. Their own palace, that's a little more unique. What that does though is it implies that she would have had her entire own identity. Well, she's from Egypt. And so, as I noted a couple weeks ago, she absolutely, well, we're not told explicitly, but the idea that she would have brought with her all of the Egyptian religious ideas and worship, completely legitimate. Now she's got her own space, and presumably her own chapel, her own capacity to bring in all of the Egyptian gods and worship styles. Where? Directly next to Solomon's palace. And where is Solomon's palace? A stone's throw from the temple. What an odd thing for Solomon to have built a palace for his wife where we can absolutely assume that all kinds of Egyptian religious stuff would have been happening down the street from what will become the temple. So I want us to hold all of that in our minds. Let me see. Yeah, that's good enough because I want to talk about Solomon's religious identity as we go into this next part where he describes the temple. So if we keep going, in verse 13, we essentially pivot to the temple. I'm sorry, any questions about this before we get to the temple's construction? Okay. In verse 13, we shift to the construction of the temple, and that shift is not very clear, so just kind of note that's where it happens. Solomon obviously wants the temple to be very grand, and part of that is that it represents the certainty, the solid nature of the entire culture. When people build big halls or big buildings, part of that is to represent how grand what it is we do is, how solid it is of what we do. And so part of what Solomon is doing here is trying to communicate that if your life is messy, if your life is uncertain, if your life is stressful and problematic, look to these buildings as a reminder that God is here and that God is certain and solid. You can rest assured that God's presence is the counterbalance to all of the uncertainty and the messiness of your life. What does that sound like? To me, it sounds like why people build big cathedrals all over the place. When you walk into grand cathedrals, cathedrals don't need high ceilings because we are tall. Cathedrals build high ceilings with grand pillars, with stained glass windows and all the other stuff in order to communicate God's huge. You know, you look up when you walk into a cathedral, the point is that your eyes are taken up, and not because there's something interesting in the ceiling, but because God is up. Cathedrals are meant to bring you up from whatever is messy and gross in your everyday life to remind you of God's grandeur. I mean, we have a similar thing that happens in our own churches. When you walk into our church here at St. Michael, your eye is lifted up and you see the cross and you see the angels and it's clean and bright and white, and there is this sense that God's somehow set apart from whatever sort of pain and mess that we live in. That God's presence reminds us that whatever we're suffering through is not all there is. And that's essentially what Solomon's doing here when he builds this big old temple. So let's look at verse 15. And we're going to go through a few of the extraordinary items that are included in the construction of the temple. First off, I want to note that Solomon goes off and hires Hiram from Tyre, who is a bronze worker, to do some remarkable stuff for the temple. Verse 15. Hiram is the he's talking about. Hiram cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of the one, and a cord of 12 cubits would encircle it. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. Jump to verse 21. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called it Yakin. And he set up the pillar on the north and called it Boaz. On the tops of the pillars was lily work. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. So we'll pause there. What he's describing here are 2 gigantic pillars of bronze. And they're not just solid straight pillars, they're super decorative pillars. The capitals that they speak of are the decorative bits that go on top of the pillars that essentially create the facade of the temple itself. These are 27 feet tall, 6 feet in diameter. That's essentially what the math is with these cubits. Now, interestingly, 27 feet tall might sound to us, it's not nothing. But 27 feet's not exactly perhaps the grandeur that we might imagine that it would be. But do remember, it's all relative. There's nothing else like this around. And the temple is set on top of a hill. And so if you're down around the Temple Mount and you're looking up at the temple, you've got the help that it's easily 50 feet above where you're likely standing. And then it's 27 feet taller than that you see these big columns. And so it would feel extremely grand and large to the people who would be approaching it. Walking uphill, those 27-foot columns seem a lot bigger. Let's keep going. Verse 23. Then he, Hiram, made the molten sea. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim and 5 cubits high. A line of 30 cubits would encircle it completely. Under its brim were panels all around it, each of 10 cubits, surrounding the sea that were 2 rows of panels cast when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them. The hindquarters of each were toward the inside. Its thickness was a handbreadth. Its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 2,000 baths. Okay, we'll pause there. What in the world? Right. This is a big, giant bowl full of water. That's what this is. That they are calling the sea. And so if you can imagine, it is a giant basin made of bronze that is set upon 12 oxen made of bronze. So it's like a really grand, almost fountain. Of course, there was no water coming out of it. But if you want to imagine, like if you've been to a big park with some big fountain in the center and it's got this big pool, that's kind of what he's creating here, is a giant pool, 2,000 baths worth of water. So if you can imagine, to be honest, it's not that gigantic, but put yourself in the position of the Israelites. A, that's a lot of bronze. And so that's pretty impressive. B, the water that goes in there, that's not a small amount of water. And this is on the Temple Mount, which is at the top of the hill. There's no water up on the top of the hill. So filling the sea, filling this big basin is not an easy task. And so when you put all of that, stack it on top of each other, this is kind of impressive. What I don't understand is whether or not the people would have been able to see the water. That's what I cannot gather, nor could I find any information out about this. So in a sense, you know the water's there, I guess, and that's impressive, but it would be like the reflection pond in front of the Lincoln Memorial. If you couldn't see that water was in it, does it have as much power as it would be if you can see the water? Not really to me, I guess, but I don't know. So the water probably had two functions. One, water is obviously important for all of the cleansing rituals that would have happened around the temple. So this could have been functional. It could have essentially been a man-made cistern of sorts that would have held a ton of water that could have then been used for physical cleansing, for rinsing out special items from the temple, for cleansing the blood from all the animals that are sacrificed. I mean, who knows? It could have just been a lot of water that priests in particular could have used up there in the temple area. But there's a metaphorical representation here as well. They did not call this a basin. They called it the sea. So what does that really mean? At this time, there was nothing more scary than the sea. I mean, the ocean represented something totally unknown. It is gigantic. It is deeper than we can tell. And scary things come off the ocean. So if you think about living near the coast, what comes off the ocean? Every storm pretty much comes off the ocean. So at that point in time, nobody had the weather app to find out what was happening, and a hurricane was coming in a few days. I mean, stuff would just show up, and the ocean was scary. Waves are crashing. If you took a boat out on the ocean, every person at this point in time would have known of somebody who went sailing off in the ocean, never to be seen again. Big fish are in the ocean. You have to think that you had random whatevers attack people from the ocean. All of this meant that the sea was scary. So for the people, what is happening here in front of the temple is a representation that God controls even what is most scary in the world. And so when the sea is held by the oxen, when the sea is held in front of the temple, God is in control of the sea. And of course, at this point, people would have had in their oral history moments like water saved Moses. Moses parted the Red Sea, and on and on. There are moments when God used water, even though it's scary, to fulfill his purposes. And so this sea, this huge basin in front of the temple, is meant to represent that even the most scary stuff in the world, God's got it. That'll make sense? All right, questions about the physical nature of the temple before we get into the dedication that Solomon goes through once the temple is complete. Yes?
Has anyone ever rebuilt the temple like exactly the same?
Good question. Has anyone ever rebuilt the temple? I should say it has been done in scale, but not in physical size, mostly because no pictures exist of this temple. Like, we have description here, so we can kind of basically figure out what it would look like, but we don't have any pictures that have remained. We do have pictures, I don't mean photographs, I mean like paintings and sketches and things like that of the second temple. Typically, when people have built the temple in a large scale, they build the second temple. I don't know of a first temple built to scale. I'm confusing myself. I don't know of a first temple being built to its actual life size. I only know it as being built to a small scale where you would almost be able to walk around it and kind of look at it from different angles. I'm thinking of places like, I don't know if do you all remember back in the early 2000s, there was essentially an amusement park, I'm sure they didn't call it that, called the Holy Land in Orlando. Do you remember this? No? I have a necktie from the Holy Land. It was meant to be a representation of essentially first century Israel, like Jerusalem, where you could walk through and you could it was built for Christians. It was meant to represent a way for Christians to go visit the Holy Land without actually going to Israel. And it was fine. I mean, it was better than like creation museums that I have seen where you have humans riding dinosaurs. But that was the second temple that was built there. So it wasn't the first. I have seen a scale replica of the first temple, but again, it's a guess. The first temple, Solomon's temple, is way smaller than the second temple that Jesus would have gone into, because Herod the Great in particular, but not only Herod the Great, expanded the second temple to be just a massive footprint. Big courtyards, big walls, lots of gilding and blah, blah, blah. And so that's a little bit different than what Solomon's temple would have. Compared to the second temple, Solomon's temple would have been much simpler. Yeah.
Question was asked, who would have access to the temple? Just the Levites and the elite?
Who would have access to the temple? That's a very good question. This first temple in particular would have only been the priests. There really was no extra space around the temple for other people. So if we talk about the first temple, Solomon's temple, it's mostly only interior space. You could walk up to it, but there really wasn't any outer courtyard, so to speak, like there is in the second temple. I mean, there is a little, but it's not significant. Essentially, what people would do is they would approach the temple and they would hand over offerings. And so the priest's main job at the temple is to make sacrifices on behalf of the people. And so we know of the major high holy days in Judaism. Those were moments where people came to the temple to sacrifice, but they physically didn't sacrifice. They gave their offerings to the priests, who then sacrificed on their behalf. It is not dissimilar to the way we represent the offerings coming to the altar in our regular Sunday worship. When we get to the offering part, the offertory in our own worship, two things happen. One, we pass plates around. That money represents the gifts of the community. And those plates are then brought forward and offered at the altar in order to essentially to be blessed by the priest on behalf of the community. There are lots of churches that would then put those plates on the altar, which is totally fine. We don't, just because we don't have enough space with all of the patens and chalices and communion vessels and all the other stuff that we have to put up there in order to serve communion. It's really just functional. But the acolytes do bring them forward and hold them up, and they're blessed. The other is, the bread and the wine are brought forward from the congregation to be put on the altar as essentially, I don't call it a sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice, it's an offering. That's why we call it an offering. But there's a similar sense that on behalf of the people, the priests are blessing what is offered by the community. So if you can imagine that offertory moment, that's essentially what happens on major feast days at the temple. The people would bring their stuff. It could be an animal, it could be crops, it could be any number of things. And then the priest would receive it and take it into the temple and offer it to God on behalf of the people who brought it. So really, people who are not priests are not going into the temple. In the second temple period, there's a little bit of a shift. There are many more concentric rings around the Holy of Holies. So we're going to get to the place where we bring the ark into the temple, which is the holiest spot. That's the center circle. And then there are a couple concentric rings around it. And in the second temple period, there were multiple courtyards around the temple. And depending on who you were, you could access those interior courtyards. So when Jesus goes into the temple and overturns the tables of the money changers, we've talked about this in here before. These were people who were selling stuff that then a person could use as an offering. So if somebody's making a long journey of a week or two or more to the temple for the holy day, it's not easy to bring your lamb or to bring your dove or whatever with you. So you would bring money and you would buy a lamb from a person who had raised the lamb right there near Jerusalem, who would have been in that first ring of courtyard. Then those money changers and merchants would not have gone into the second ring. That second ring is basically for men. But they could bring in their offerings, and that's where you found things like the place where offerings were burned and other stuff like that. Then there were more rings inside that would only be for priests. So there's a bit more of a give and take of non-priests in the second temple than in the first temple. So that was probably too much information. Any follow-up questions on that? Yeah.
Just another question. In the early days of Catholicism, didn't people go up to the priest with prayers, maybe for their family, and ask those prayers of the priest, and then the priest prayed for them?
Yeah, so the question is, in early Catholicism, I would just say probably in the first millennia of Christianity, you had a unified church, but that continued into the second millennia of Christianity with both Roman Catholicism and Orthodox traditions, where it's essentially intercessory prayer. So I know people joke with me occasionally, but people still kind of think this. Sometimes when someone's going through a serious thing in their life, they actually will ask me to pray on their behalf, and then they'll say something that's meant to be kind of a joke, but not really a joke. Like, I need somebody closer to God to pray for this for me. And it's the sense being like, we assume the priest is probably like on the sliding scale a little better Christian than me. So would you pray too? Because you're probably a little closer to God. It's that kind of thing, which we kind of do that as Anglicans, but intercessory prayer is something that we only do a little of. So I equate this to when people say, why do Catholics worship Mary or worship the saints and that sort of stuff? They do not. But Catholics and Orthodox Christians in particular, and some Anglicans for sure, have it within their own individual piety that Mary and the saints and even priests can pray on an individual's behalf and intercede with God in a way that perhaps the individual cannot. That's not a real thing, but I get that there is a nice feeling about that. It's sort of like if you ask your friend, I've always equated the saints to being like a good friend who's really good with God. And so if something's going wrong in your life, you may ask your friends to pray for you. Well, why wouldn't a saint also pray for you? It's kind of like the friend you never met, but you trust they're pretty solid with God, right? A saint. And so that's essentially the way that the priesthood functioned for a very long time. We have a little of that in our Anglican tradition, but we have tried to flatten it enough to where we regularly remind people. If you look at the baptismal covenant and what we say every time we renew our baptismal covenants or we baptize people, we remind everyone, we use the phrase, the priesthood of all believers. We try to reinforce that, yes, priests have particular roles within the community, but we're not the professional Christians. We are not the ones who can get God to do stuff better than you can. That's not really how it works. We are much more representative of what everyone who follows Jesus can be. And so when we use the phrase priesthood of all believers, even though I might wear a collar and say stuff in worship, I'm no better than anyone else. I'm just the one doing the stuff on behalf of everyone else. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We think the same thing about marriage. If you go to a wedding, you'll see very explicitly when we do weddings, if the priest does it right, that the bride and groom will start off shoulder to shoulder, facing the priest. That's the first half. That's the service of word. That's when you hear the lesson read, there are a couple prayers, there's a homily, all that happens. When it comes time for the vows and rings, the couple faces each other. I do not marry the bride and groom. They marry each other. However, I do speak on behalf of everyone gathered the blessing that we offer them on their marriage. Does that make sense? And I'll tell you, I say it all the time to brides and groom. Every time I do a wedding, I remind them that when they give their vows and they exchange their rings, they are not doing so with me. Because I cannot tell you how often a bride or a groom, when I say, now repeat after me, looks at me. And I'll be like, the other person. So, it really is them doing that. And it's a great representation of how I am speaking on behalf of everyone gathered, the blessing that we give them in their marriage. Same thing at baptism, same thing at Eucharist. I mean, all of that stuff is we're just putting audible words to the prayer we are all doing at the same time. So next time when you actually go through the Eucharistic prayer, ideally, you are not kneeling, waiting for me to stop talking so you can get communion. That's not the best of Eucharist. The best of Eucharist is that you're actually joining with me in the prayer over the bread and the wine to then receive it. Even if you're not physically speaking the words, you're with me in that prayer as we go through the consecration. Any other questions? All right. I don't really remember where I was. So let's look at I haven't read verse 22 yet, have I? No, thank you. Okay. So now that we have established the physical details of the temple, let's talk about the way that Solomon dedicates the temple. So, Verse 22, let's just read it and then we'll talk about it. Verse 22, Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel and spread out his hands to heaven. He said, O Lord God of Israel, there is no one like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and steadfast love for your servants who walk before you with all their heart. The covenant that you kept for your servant my father David, as you declared to him, you promised with your mouth and have this day fulfilled with your hand. Therefore, O Lord God of Israel, keep for your servant my father David that which you promised him, saying, There shall never fail you a successor before me to sit on the throne of Israel, if only your children look to their way to walk before me as you have walked before me. Therefore, O God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you promised to your servant my father David. At this point, we'll pause there. Solomon's dedication is both performative and predictive. So I think it's safe to say, and I was debating whether or not to say this because I don't want it to be misperceived, but up to this point, Solomon is not really shown to be personally religious. Not like David. David was constantly praying and speaking to God on his own. He was doing so behind closed doors, in his room, in his chapel. David was always talking with God. Solomon is almost completely opposite. Solomon only seems to do stuff with God that everyone else can see him do. So there is this performative aspect of Solomon. Now, was Solomon personally faithful and religious? Maybe. We really don't get that in any of these stories. Solomon is not described as being personally religious. Solomon is described as really being corporately religious. Now, a charitable interpretation of that would be that Solomon was doing all that stuff in private and the storyteller just didn't note it. I think perhaps a more realistic understanding of this, and maybe halfway cynical, is that Solomon understood the political value of being religious. And so Solomon goes off and marries non-Jews, but he definitely knows how to show up in front of the people and make himself sound really religious and faithful. I think either interpretation is totally legit. It helps, not helps, that's not a wrong word. I cannot help but think that Solomon was a good politician, because I mostly think that when we see our own politicians be religious, it is performative and not authentic. I mean, how many people see politicians speak in religious words and you think, BS? I mean, you don't think this at all. You do not feel that. That does not mean anything to you. I mean, we see them act in these terrible ways. I mean, it is fascinating to me that we as a people seem to be able to hold together someone's really unethical and immoral actions next to some kind of belief that they're actually a good, religious, faithful person. I think it's totally perverse. And I would invite you to maybe think of that for yourself. If you find that you see a person representing both, we could take a charitable, grace-filled perspective on this and think everyone's imperfect. I also think that's a little bit BS, because reconciliation, when someone has done something wrong, is at its heart meant to put someone on a new path to not do the same stuff again. When someone does the same stuff over and over and over again, at some point, it's okay for us to say, are you actually sorry? Do you actually care? Because it kind of seems like you don't care. It's sort of like watching children apologize once again for doing the same thing to their sibling. How many times do you hear tell your sister you're sorry, you hit her. And you're like, sorry. And you think, yeah, I bet you are. So it's that kind of thing where at some point you kind of say you either are a faithful person or you are not. And if you're not making actual strides toward being better, not perfect, do not hear me say perfect, but towards that, what really are you doing? And I say that to anyone at any age, in any phase. If you're not actually trying to improve, what then are you doing? Because if you're not trying to improve, what's happening? And so regardless of where you are in your life, one should hope to improve as a faithful person. That's a super fine line that I'm walking, because we should not then judge people for their lack of improvement. But should we encourage people trying to improve? Yeah. What else are we doing? I mean, to me, that's the function of religion, as separate from spirituality. One can be spiritual, knowing God is real and sensing God and all the other stuff. Great. What religion does is it actually puts your spirituality into action. And so if the people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, are really people who are saying, I don't want to actually be responsible for my spirituality. I just want to claim it because it feels good. Well, sorry, not good enough. Because you are human, just like all of us, and humans are messy and imperfect. If you're not trying to put yourself essentially in some kind of mold or crucible or whatever to try and keep you from to try and make you better than you were yesterday, do you actually care to be better? Or do you just want to use the words? And I kind of see that with Solomon. Solomon just speaks the word. Solomon's got great game. Solomon totally knows what he's doing. And in a minute, you're going to see Solomon's hands out, head up. I mean, he does all the stuff. He looks the part. I just don't see anything more than that in the story. And so just something to note. I don't know what to do with that, but I just wanted you to have that. Let's see. Let's keep going just real quickly, and then I'll shift to prayers because I've been talking too long. Verse 27. This is still Solomon talking. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I have built. Regard your servant's prayer and his plea, O Lord my God, heeding the cry and the prayer that your servants pray to you today, that your eyes may be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you said, my name shall be there, that you may heed the prayer that your servant prays toward this place. Hear the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Oh, here in heaven, your dwelling place, heed and forgive. Solomon kind of closes out this dedication moment by saying the temple represents God's promise to the people on earth. The temple embodies God's presence on earth. Solomon seems to understand that this whole idea of God living in the temple is sort of silly. God's much bigger than that. I mean, he literally says, will you indeed dwell on the earth? Well, even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house that I built. So Solomon really does acknowledge the house of God. That's kind of the name of the house. There is no perception that somehow this house contains God, but it sure does represent God. It represents God's promise in a very real way, and that matters to the people. We, in our humanity, need God to be represented in some way. The danger then is we think then the building is God. And we totally know this, by the way. We can make all of our sacred stuff even more important than the God it's meant to represent. And we can get all up in arms and mad, and we can be all self-righteous about who puts what banner where, and the color of that thing, and the chalice goes there, and the priest stands there, whatever. I mean, it just is on and on and on. We can get all wrapped up in doing it the right way, as if doing it the right way makes it godly. And not because God is present, because we are here. You know, one of the great frustrations I have in our English language is that we call this space the church, but we also call the people the church. It'd be so helpful if we actually said it differently, because the church is never the building. The church is only the people. But we confuse it with our language because what else are we supposed to call it? I don't know. If you think of something clever, let me know. But it's essentially a limit to the way that we describe stuff in English. And it then shapes what we think. We begin to think that we aren't the church, that this building is the church. That's not the case. This building is just where the church gathers. That's actually the thing we should say. Okay, I've got to get on with Solomon's how to pray. Questions? Okay, I find this next section very interesting. So after the dedication moment, and Solomon shifts away from kind of the big bless this house to essentially what can we pray for? How do we pray? And Solomon almost systematically goes through some macro ways of praying right. Obviously, Solomon did not write this. And so I want you to listen to these as we step through them as being so clearly indicative of what the Jews figured out for themselves when they were in exile. It's really an amazing section. So let's look at, we're going to begin with chapter 31. Sorry, I don't know if I ever told you we shifted to chapter 8. Did I? No. We're in chapter 8. Sorry about that. Not one of you asked, by the way. Okay. When we go through this, think about not only that this is indicative of the exilic and post-exilic Jewish identity, but what do you think about this? Like, how would you actually receive and handle these macro umbrellas of prayer? All right, verse 31. Chapter 8. Okay, verse 31. If someone sins against a neighbor and is given an oath to swear and comes and swears before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing their conduct on their own head and vindicating the righteous by rewarding them according to their righteousness. We'll stop there. We can pray to God to seek justice. Okay, here's the first prayer. God is meant to be the arbiter of what is and is not just. You can bring that to God, and then it will be interpreted by God. Now, we've seen Solomon do this. Judges are meant to represent that kind of good judgment of God. Now, obviously, we have separated religious and state in this country, so that's not really what judges would do for us, but it's not unlike what judges are supposed to do. They're supposed to seek justice. I mean, we say justice, justice, justice all the time. Well, what is that kind of justice? Well, now that's a civil definition. At this point in time, and maybe it should have remained, a religious definition, where justice is not what we think, but justice is what God thinks. And of course, for us, that means Jesus. Verse 33, number 2. When your people Israel have sinned against you, are defeated before an enemy, but turn again to you, confess your name, pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven, forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them again to the land that you gave to their ancestors. So we can pray for reconciliation when we've done something wrong. This is interesting because Solomon is almost yoking reconciliation to the physical temple. Like when that's done here, then answer their prayers. It's interesting because I'm sure all of us have at some point wondered why the Jewish people care so much, well, some Jewish people care so much about the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. They're trying to be as close as possible to the temple. And here's just one of many reasons why, because when prayers are said in the temple, then God fulfills those prayers. And if Jews can't get to the place of the temple, well, the temple doesn't exist right now, but if they can't be in the place where the temple did exist, they want to be as close as possible to that place. And today, the closest possible way they can get there is at that Western Wall, which is not the wall of the temple. It is simply a retaining wall that holds up the Temple Mount, but it's as close as they can get. And if you go to Israel today, you are welcome, head covered and everything, to go to the wall yourself and to actually write a prayer and stick it into the wall between the rocks on paper. So there still is this sense of somehow your prayer is better by being closest to the temple. Number 3, verse 37. If there is famine in the land, if there is plague, blight, mildew, locust, or caterpillar, if their enemy besieges them in any of their cities, whatever plague, whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever plea there is from any individual or from all your people Israel, all knowing the afflictions of their own hearts, so that they stretch out their hands toward this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, forgive, act, and render to all whose hearts you know, according to all their ways, for only you know what is in every human heart, so that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our ancestors. So we can pray for help when things go wrong in the world, and we don't actually have to be in the temple. If we just simply look toward the temple, then we can get God's help. But God knows what we truly believe in our hearts. And so part of this is an expression of what is authentically in us, not just saying the right words at the right time. That kind of presence in our heart is important. Number 4, verse 41. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a distant land because of your name, for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. When a foreigner comes and prays toward this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and do according to all that the foreigner calls to you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, so that they may know that your name has been invoked on this house that I have built. So number 4, we can pray for God's inclusion of those outside Judaism. That is very interesting, isn't it? We don't hear that very often, but Solomon is setting that as an expectation of not only hospitality, but inclusion. Number 5, verse 44. If your people go out to battle against their enemy, by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to the Lord toward the city that you have chosen and the house that you have built for your name, then hear in heaven their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause. This 5th thing is about praying to be delivered against enemies of the state. That was very interesting. This is part of what creates the idea of a just war theory. We've likely heard this many different ways, but we hear you probably know that depending on the section of the Old Testament that defines the 10 Commandments, one of the commandments is either thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder. Well, kill and murder, those are very different when it comes to the actions of war, like a justified, sanctioned kind of act. Murder would imply no permission to do so. It is wrong fundamentally to do that. Kill means you shouldn't, I'm sorry, did I just get that backwards? Murdering means that there's a difference, that's what I want to say. There's a difference between sanctioned killing and non-sanctioned killing. Somebody walks into a bank in Louisville and starts shooting at people, that's murder. But a soldier going out on the field of battle and kill somebody, that's not murder in the sense that it has been a sanctioned act. In other words, we have in some sense collectively decided that taking action in that way is necessary for a greater good. If you think that the commandments are thou shalt not kill, then neither is okay. But if it's thou shalt not murder, then maybe occasionally killing is justified. Thank you, Bub just gave me the wave. I'm over time. Sorry. Because the last one is the big old pivot. So we're going to start there next week. So we're not quite done yet, but I'd love for you, go off and read kind of the end of this chapter, starting verse 46 through 53. There's a big pivot right here in the way that Solomon says to pray, and we're going to start off next week with that. Thanks, y'all. See you next week.